Close your eyes for a second. Imagine you're standing in the middle of New York City. 8 million people around you. Noise everywhere. Lights everywhere. Life everywhere. Now imagine that in the middle of all that noise, all that light, all that life, there are places where something else exists. Something that doesn't belong to the living. Something that has refused to leave. New York City is one of the most visited places on Earth. Millions of people walk its streets every single day. But there are corners of this city, quiet corners, dark corners, where the past has never let go, where the walls remember things that happened inside them, where the air feels different the moment you walk in. I'm going to take you to 3 of those places tonight. 3 real locations in the middle of one of the most famous cities in the world. And I need you to understand something before we begin. These are not legends invented to sell tickets. These are not ghost tour stories designed to entertain tourists. The people who experienced what I'm about to describe are real people who went into these places expecting nothing unusual and came out changed. The first place I want to take you is a hospital. Not an abandoned one, not a crumbling ruin in the middle of nowhere. A real hospital that operated for over a century, that treated hundreds of thousands of patients, and that, according to the people who worked inside it, never fully let go of the ones who died there. Bellevue Hospital, Est 1736. The oldest public hospital in the entire United States. Most people don't know Bellevue's real history. They know the name. They've seen it in movies and TV shows. But the actual history of that building is something that most of the people who walk past it every day have no idea about. Bellevue started not as a hospital, but as a 6-bed infirmary attached to a poorhouse. It was built to treat the people nobody else wanted to treat. The destitute, the mentally ill, the criminals, the dying with no family and no money. For the first 100 years of its existence, Bellevue was where New York City sent the people it wanted to forget. By the mid-1800s, Bellevue had become the largest hospital in the country. And with that size came something else, a morgue. One of the busiest morgues in the entire nation. Bodies were brought there from all over the city, unidentified, unclaimed, unknown. People who died on the streets, people who drowned in the East River, people who had no one to identify them and no one to bury them. For decades, Bellevue's morgue held the remains of thousands of people whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, whose bodies were eventually buried in mass graves on Hart Island, without ceremony, without markers, without anyone who cared. Now think about that for a moment. Think about what that means. Thousands of people who died alone, who were forgotten completely, whose last connection to the world of the living was the cold stone floor of Bellevue's basement morgue. Is it really so hard to believe that some of them never left? The report started surfacing seriously in the 1970s. Night shift nurses were the first to talk. Not publicly, not on record, but among themselves, in the break rooms, in hushed conversations after particularly strange nights. They talked about the sounds. Footsteps in hallways that should have been empty. Doors opening and closing on floors that had been locked for the night. Call buttons lighting up in rooms with no patients. One nurse, who worked the overnight shift in the psychiatric ward for 11 years, described hearing what she could only call crying. Not a patient. She was certain of that. She had spent over a decade learning the sounds of patient distress. She knew what it sounded like when a patient was in pain, when a patient was frightened, when a patient was confused. This was different. This was coming from somewhere inside the walls. A low, rhythmic sound.
like someone who had been crying for so long they had forgotten what they were crying about. She heard it on 17 separate occasions over her 11 years there, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always from the same section of wall, always stopping the moment she put her hand against the plaster. She requested a transfer after the 11th year. She told her supervisor it was for personal reasons.
She never told her supervisor the real reason. She told me, years later, that she transferred because of one specific night. A night when the crying stopped, not because she touched the wall, but because whatever was making the sound touched her first. She felt it on the back of her neck, a hand, or what felt like a hand, cold, specific, deliberate. She turned around immediately. The hallway was completely empty. She was the only person on that floor. She had checked 15 minutes earlier. She walked off that floor and never went back. But the nurses weren't the only ones. In 2009, a maintenance worker named Daniel was assigned to do repair work in the sub-basement of the older Bellevue building. The sub-basement is one of the original sections of the structure. Stone walls, low ceilings, pipes running along every surface. The kind of place that feels old the moment you step into it. The kind of place where the air itself seems heavier somehow. Daniel was down there alone, replacing a section of pipe, when he heard footsteps above him. He assumed it was someone on the ground floor. He kept working, but the footsteps didn't move the way footsteps move when someone is walking from one place to another. They moved in a circle, slow, deliberate, the same path, over and over.
Bellevue Hospital is still operating today. It treats thousands of patients every year. Its staff is professional and dedicated, and most of them will tell you nothing unusual has ever happened there. But if you find the ones who work the night shift in the older sections of the building, and if you ask them the right...
Story 2 I want to take you is different. It's not a hospital. It's not a place associated with death or suffering in any obvious way. In fact, on the surface, it looks like one of the most beautiful buildings in New York City. The Dakota, 72nd Street and Central Park West, one of the most famous residential buildings in the world. Built in 1884, home over the decades to some of the most celebrated names in American culture. You may know the Dakota for one reason above all others. It is the building where John Lennon was shot and killed in December of 1980. But the Dakota's history with the unexplained goes back much further than that night. Much further.
When the Dakota was built in 1884, it was considered so far uptown, so remote from the rest of the city, that people joked it might as well be in the Dakotas. That's where the name came from. At that time, the area around 72nd Street was not the polished Upper West Side it is today. It was rough land, undeveloped, isolated. And the building itself, with its Gothic turrets and dark stone facade, looked from the beginning like something that had arrived from a different time entirely. The first reports of unusual activity at the Dakota came within 20 years of its construction. Residents and staff described a young girl, seen in the hallways, always in the same section of the building, always in the same clothing, a yellow dress, hair tied back, playing with a ball.
The sightings were dismissed at first. The building had families. Children lived there. It was easy to assume this was simply a child who lived in the building, until people began to notice that the girl was always alone, that she never spoke, that when approached, she simply wasn't there anymore. The sightings of the girl in the yellow dress have been reported continuously, from the 1890s to as recently as 2019. Over 120 years of the same figure, in the same section of hallway, in the same yellow dress, playing silently with a ball that makes no sound when it hits the floor.
Former Dakota employee Marcus, who worked as a night doorman for 6 years in the 1990s, described his own encounter in the upper hallway of the 7th floor. He had taken the service elevator up to check on a report of a door left open. The hallway was empty when he arrived. He checked the door. It was closed and locked. He turned to go back to the elevator, and she was standing at the end of the hallway. He said his first thought was completely practical. A child of one of the residents, he assumed. Up too late. He called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help getting back to your apartment?" The girl turned to face him. He described her face as perfectly normal. Young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Dark eyes. And then she smiled. Marcus said later it was the smile that was wrong. Not the face, not the eyes. The smile. He said it was the smile of someone who had been in that hallway for a very long time, and found it faintly amusing that he didn't know it. Then she was gone. Not gone like she walked away. Gone like a frame cut from a film. Present one moment, absent the next. Marcus finished his shift. He did not report what he saw. He told his wife that night. He told me, decades later, that he has thought about that smile almost every single day since. But the girl in the yellow dress is not the only presence associated with the Dakota. There is the matter of the basement. The Dakota's basement is one of the original sections of the building, and it has been the subject of reports, consistent, separate, unconnected reports, for over a century. Workers who went down there alone and came back up quickly. Workers who refused to go down there at all. A building superintendent in the 1950s who kept a written log, later discovered by a subsequent superintendent, of every occasion on which he heard sounds in the basement that he could not explain. The log ran to 43 entries over 8 years. Each entry described the same thing. Voices. Not words exactly. Not a conversation. More like the echo of a conversation. As if the basement walls were replaying something they had absorbed long ago. Over and over. On a loop that had no beginning and no end. The building's management has never commented publicly on any of these reports. The Dakota remains one of the most sought-after addresses in New York City. Its apartments sell for millions. Its residents are among the most prominent people in the city. And most of them will tell you nothing unusual has ever happened there. But the girl in the yellow dress keeps appearing. In the same hallway. In the same dress. With the same silent ball. And the same smile that knows something you don't. She has been there since 1890. She will probably be there in 2090. Whatever she is waiting for, she has not found it yet.
The third place I want to take you tonight is the one that took me the longest to decide to include. Not because I doubted the accounts, but because of what the accounts describe. Because unlike Bellevue, unlike the Dakota, this location does not just involve sounds or shadows or glimpses of something unexplained. This location involves something that interacted, something that responded, something that, according to multiple separate witnesses across multiple separate decades, knew exactly who was standing in front of it.
The building at the corner of 14th Street and 9th Avenue in Manhattan has had many names and many uses over the past century and a half. But in the 1840s and 1850s, it served as a holding facility, a place where people were kept before being transferred elsewhere. Some to prisons, some to hospitals, some to ships bound for places they had not chosen to go. The records from this period are incomplete. Many were deliberately destroyed. What is known is that in a period of roughly 15 years, a significant number of people passed through that building, under conditions that the historical record describes only in the most clinical terms. But clinical terms cannot fully describe what it means to be held in a place against your will, with no certainty about what comes next.
The building was eventually converted, used for different purposes over the decades, renovated multiple times. By the late 20th century, it had become a commercial space. Offices on the upper floors, retail on the ground level. A completely ordinary Manhattan building from the outside. The accounts begin in 1987. A woman named Patricia, working late alone in her office on the 4th floor, heard her name spoken clearly behind her. She turned around. The office was empty. She assumed she had imagined it. In 1994, a security guard named Thomas was doing his overnight rounds on the 3rd floor. He heard footsteps in the stairwell. He investigated. He found the stairwell empty. He was turning to leave when the door at the bottom of the stairwell, which he had just confirmed was empty, opened slowly, all the way, and then closed, with no one there. Thomas stood in that stairwell for a full minute, watching the door, waiting. Nothing happened. He went back to his rounds. He told his supervisor the next morning. His supervisor told him it was probably a draft. Thomas said nothing more, but he requested a reassignment to a different building 3 weeks later. The account that finally made me decide to include this location came from a man I will call Robert. Robert worked in that building for 9 years, from 2003 to 2012. He is a rational person, professionally trained, not given to imagination or exaggeration. He told me what happened to him on a Tuesday evening in November of 2009. He was alone in the building after 7 p.m., finishing a project. He went to the bathroom on the 2nd floor, a small single-occupancy bathroom with a lock on the door. He locked the door behind him. He was standing at the sink, washing his hands, when he looked up into the mirror. He said later that his brain needed several full seconds to process what he was seeing, because what he was seeing made no sense. There was someone else in the reflection, standing directly behind him, in a room that was locked from the inside, in a room he had confirmed was empty when he entered. He described the figure as a man, standing very still, wearing clothing that was wrong for the present day in a way he couldn't immediately identify. The figure was looking not at Robert, but slightly past him, as if looking at something in the middle distance that only the figure could see. Robert said he did not scream. He did not move. He stood at that sink, with the water still running over his hands, and stared into the mirror for what he believes was about 4 seconds. Then the figure turned its head, very slowly, and looked directly at Robert. Robert unlocked the door and left the building. He did not go back for his coat. He did not go back for his bag. He stood on 14th Street in the November cold, without his jacket, for 20 minutes before he could make himself think clearly enough to call a cab. he told me one final thing, something he had never told anyone else. He said that in the 4 seconds before the figure turned to look at him, he had the overwhelming sense, not of fear exactly, but of recognition. As if whatever was standing behind him in that mirror was not a stranger. As if it knew him. Not his name, not his face. Something deeper than that. Something that couldn't be explained by anything in Robert's ordinary life. He said it felt like being recognized by something that had been waiting specifically for him for a very long time.
He quit his job 2 weeks later. He cited personal reasons. He has never spoken about this publicly. He spoke to me only after I agreed not to use his real name. And he said one thing at the very end of our conversation that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He said, "The worst part isn't what I saw. The worst part is that I've gone back to that street twice since then. Not because I wanted to. I don't know why I went. I just found myself standing there, looking up at that window. Both times. And both times, I had the feeling that whatever is in that building was looking back. 3 places. 1 city. Bellevue. New York City has 8 million people. 8 million stories. 8 million lives moving through its streets every single day. But underneath all of that noise, underneath all of that light, there are other stories. Older stories. Stories that belong to the ones who never left. And if you ever find yourself in one of these places, if you ever feel the air change around you, if you ever hear your name spoken in an empty room, don't look in the mirror. Don't respond to the voice. And whatever you do, don't look up at the window on your way out. Because something up there might already be looking back at you.